Hi everyone, welcome to my new Final Fantasy TCG deck profile. I'm going to be looking at, I can't believe I'm saying this, Bartz's Bouncing Warriors of Light. This is a deck that I built and ran not too long back, probably, where are we now? Like February of 2022, if you're watching this later down the line. And it functioned pretty well. Now, that's not to say that it didn't have its problems, because given the fact that it's in tri-color, it means that you definitely can break, and it can go pretty bad. So you do need that kind of smooth setup phase. But if you can get that off and get all the right elements down, then you're good to go, probably. So let's dive into it. Let's look at the cards. So I run the deck with 27 forward, 16 backups, and 7 summons, all throughout fire, wind, and water. And there's a decent amount of EXs as well. You've got the likes of Ark and Bartz and Gao, and Leviathan as well, but none of them are offensive. So really, you have to focus on just laying the field, getting your backups ready so that you can start playing things. So let's look at the cards individually. So first off, we have Sol. So he is just a 1 CP 2000 power forward, but he is still very instrumental in the deck because ultimately he gains haste from having any other warrior light forward on the field, which is obviously going to happen. But then when he forms a party and attacks, you can search for a job warrior of light of cost 2 or more and add it to your hand. Now if you've got Aegis on the field, that means that you can party with, or any warriors of light can party together, but ultimately there's a decent amount of fire forwards in the deck anyway, so he should be able to party with them. And when you do, you can search basically any warrior of light. The only one he cannot search is himself, but this also means that he can search the Sarah FFL backup as well, which is really good because he can search you any job warrior of light. Again, he's only 1 CP, which means that if you play him onto the field with Faris, he's probably going to be dealing a little bit of damage, but still for 1 CP, that's perfectly fine. And again, he will have haste, which makes him more of a threat. And ultimately, 1 CP to get a 2 CP reduction on another forward is really, really good. Next, we got Luneth. So he buffs all the fire and warrior light forwards you have, except himself, and then you can dull him, or dull a total of 3 active fire forwards or fire backups to deal 2000 damage to a forward, which may not seem that incredible, but it has a couple of uses, and I've actually been able to use this ability 1 or twice just to be able to finish something off or kill some smaller forwards. So it might be a case that you're blocking with something and you can just dull maybe a couple of backups and Luneth himself to then kill that forward off. But ultimately, it's also really good to be able to move some of your forwards out of the way if, say, they're being killed by something because they're active. So if you're up against lightning and there's lots of choose an active forward, kill it, that sort of thing, then being able to dull your fire forwards to get them out of harm's way using Luneth is also pretty good. But ultimately, Luneth's main point is the fact that he buffs all of your warriors of light, because most of the warrior lights are generally in about 7 or 8k power, so getting them just over that threshold and into safety out of the harm's way of most of Fire's things is really, really useful. Next we have Aegis. So Aegis can make it so that all warriors of light forwards can party with any element, and then when Aegis enters the field, you may play 1 warrior of light of cost 4 or less from your hand onto the field. So again, just extremely good value when he enters the field. Now, if you have been able to reduce his cost through Faris, it then means he's only 3 CP and he can play himself and another forward onto the field. And this is where things start to get hilarious. Let's say you played Faris onto the field and then you play Aegis for 3. With Aegis, you then play, I don't know, Dusk. And through Dusk, you pay the 1 water to then play Lena. You play Lena onto the field and play, I don't know, let's say Sol and Warrior Light from your break zone. And you have just played 5 forwards for what is effectively 4 CP. That's incredible value, and bearing in mind that I said you start all this with Faris coming onto the field, it means that every single time these forwards enter the field, you can either deal lots of damage to your opponent, or your opponent's forwards even, or just stack the cost reduction on another warrior of light, and you can you can stack the cost reduction as well. So that's just an excellent way to go about this. But ultimately, what the good thing is as well is that you can have Aegis enter the field. That will trigger both Faris and Aegis. But what happens is that you can choose Aegis to resolve first, so Aegis will then bring something in. That will then trigger Faris again, but also that card's entry ability. So again, let's say you use Dusk, you can then have it so Dusk's ability resolves first before the second Faris trigger. He brings something in, maybe that card then brings something else in, and every single time a forward enters, if that forward has an entry ability, you can stack it so it brings another forward into the field before Faris resolves. And then when it comes to the final point of resolution, you let everything resolve. Every single time Faris's ability was triggered and then resolves, it will count how many Warrior of Light forwards you have in the field. And if you did Aegis into Dusk, into Lena, into just Warrior of Light with Faris already on the field, that is every single time that's triggering, counting 5 forwards. So you're then getting 5 instances of dealing 10k to something, which is just bonkers. Yeah, so incredibly strong, incredibly easy just to play stupid amounts of forwards onto the field and kill lots of things at the same time. Y'shtola. So yeah, you really want to protect your forward. So let's say you're playing something onto the field and ultimately you really want to protect Bartz, because Bartz is the only one that can't protect himself. But ultimately, yeah, just stopping things like Amaterasu or just things that are trying to outright kill your forwards or cancelling their abilities, having Y'shtola there ready to stop either the cancelling effects or just cancelling summons, you know, just ultimately having that protection is essential really to this deck. And most of the things that aren't Warriors of Light in this deck tend to be more geared towards protecting them. They themselves are the destruction, and that's all you really need to worry about. So everything else is just there to supplement them and keep them on the field. Warrior of Light, another fantastic forward in this deck, which doesn't get a huge amount of play, but in this deck I think does wonders. So when he enters the field, during this turn, the next damage dealt to you becomes 0 instead, and then you can pay 0 to choose one forward other than Warrior of Light. It gains plus 2000 power until the end of the turn, and during this turn, when that forward is put from the field of the break zone, Warrior of Light deals you 1 point of damage, but you can only use this ability once per turn. Now, the reason that I like this is because you can ultimately, let's say Warrior of Light dies on your opponent's turn, you block with him, put him into the break zone, you then trigger Bartz's ability to play him back onto the field for 3 crystals. That then means that when he enters the field, you can make it so the next point of damage becomes 0, so you can then let the next damage come through, or if you really want to, just use Warrior Light's ability to buff something that you know is going to die anyway, and then even though that forward is buffed, you still don't take the damage because of Warrior Light's ability. And again, you can use this alongside Lena coming in, or Dusk as well. Bartz, now this is the core of the deck, and he is just fantastic. If you can get Bartz onto the field and to stay on the field, he is just a nightmare for your opponent. So he is an EX burst, but when a drop Warrior of Light other than Bartz enters the field, you gain a crystal, which is really good because, as I mentioned before, it's super easy just to play so many Warrior Lights onto the field and just gain stupid amounts of crystal. What's also nice is that it's just when a drop Warrior of Light other than Bartz enters the field. So again, that counts the Sarah backup as well as the Refia backup. And then if you have a crystal, Bartz gains plus 2000 power. Again, super easy to fulfill that. And he then becomes a 10k, which again is a problem for your opponent. And then finally, the most important ability, when a job Warrior of Light you control is put from the field into the break zone, you may pay 3 crystals. When you do so, play it onto the field. This effect will trigger only once per turn. So it means that you can only use it once to save something, but the chances are when that forward re-enters, it's going to be doing some nasty stuff, especially if Faris is on the field. And if Faris is the one to die, then she comes in and she will still count all of the Warriors of Light forward you control and deal X amount of damage for that. So yeah, but ultimately Bartz can't save himself, which is a problem. But that's why you have things like Y'shtola and Leviathan and Amaterasu just to make sure he survives. And you do need to bear in mind that it's when a Warrior of Light other than Bartz enters the field, he gains a crystal, which means that every time one enters the field, that opens up an opportunity for your opponent to kill him, if it's Amaterasu or just casting a summon just to kill something. Either way, there is so many opportunities for your opponent just to respond and kill Bartz before that crystal even comes onto the stack. Arc. So when Arc enters the field, choose up to 3 job standard unit or warrior light, activate them. That's really good. But then damage 3, you get to choose 1 job standard unit or job warrior light of cost 3 or less in your break zone and play it onto the field. So yeah, I mean, he gets to reactivate things when he enters, which is really, really good. Not a huge amount of dull abilities in this deck, but it does just mean that you can maybe cast a summon or just reactivate more backups to play more things. He can become cost reduced through Lena, so that means, you know, if you're playing him for only 3 CP, he's bringing something in and he's reactivating stuff, he's effectively a free card at that point. And then the cards he can bring in are the likes of Lena and Dusk and all the things that I mentioned before, so he can just keep on playing forwards and then more forwards and more forwards and more forwards, and just it snowballs out of control. And then again, a fantastic card to flicker with Bartz as well. So you block with Arc, he goes into the break zone, you pay the 3 crystals to bring him back in, you reactivate 3 things, you play something from your deck, and it's just so good, man. Gao. Now, yeah, he doesn't really fit, to be honest, but he is an EX crystal gain, and that is important. And one of the problems I faced with this deck was ultimately having Bartz on the field long enough for you to gain crystals to be able to use Bartz's effect. So having an EX burst that can become an 8k, that's also a target for Lena, I think is super important. So yeah, just having that little guy there just to be able to generate you crystal, potentially block something for 8k, and then being an EX as well, I think is just well worth it. Dusk. So when Dusk enters the field, you may pay 1 water. When you do so, play 1 forward of cost 3 or less from your hand onto the field. So again, he could become just a 1 CP through Faris. You play him, you then pay the 1 water, and this is where I run something like Philo, because I think Philo, you know, you might have 1 or 2 water backups, but if you've used that to play Dusk, then having that additional water may come in clutch. So having Philo there to generate the water is nice. But yeah, ultimately, pay the 1 water to then play any other 3 CP forward from your hand, which again is most of the Warriors of Light. Your Warrior Light, Lunith, Lena, it's just, there's a lot of good forwards that he can bring in. And again, with Faris, dealing lots of damage when it enters, or just stacking the cost reduction of the next card you play. And then Blessing actually is decent as well. So an S and Water, choose 1 forward of cost 3 or less other than Dusk. It gains plus 5,000 power until the end of the turn, and you get to draw a card. So you can protect something if you really need to. Lena, yep, you pay 1 crystal, bring a forward of 1 or 2 or less onto the field, and then you pay 2 crystals to bring in a forward of 3 or less onto the field. So for the first ability, your only targets are Sol and Gao, so not a huge amount of them, but they aren't essential to come in anyway. So yeah, ultimately being able to bring Lena in to then bring in something like Dusk to then bring in something else, just yeah, you see where this is going. Like, all the forwards play everything else. And something that I forgot to mention earlier about Bartz as well is the fact that all these forwards, whilst they're entering, might be triggering Faris, but they also will be triggering Bartz's ability. So you play Lena onto the field, and say you play Lena and then you use a crystal to play Sol, and then you use 2 crystals to play, I don't know, Warrior of Light. Lena has entered, Sol has entered, Warrior of Light has entered, 3 Warriors of Light have entered. If you've got Bartz on the field, that means you pay 3 crystals to have those 3 forwards enter, but you get those 3 crystals back immediately through Bartz's effect. So you've actually paid nothing for Lena's effect, really, which is just insane. Faris, yet another crux of the deck, being able to just reduce the cost of your Warriors of Light or just dealing stupid amounts of damage. So yeah, it's when Faris or a job Warrior of Light forward enters the field, select one of the 2 following actions. Choose 1 forward, deal it 2,000 damage for each job Warrior of Light forward you control, or during this turn, the cost required to cast your next job Warrior of Light is reduced by 2, it cannot become 0. Now what's special there is the fact that that final ability, during this turn, the cost required to cast your next job Warrior of Light is reduced by 2, that also applies to your Sarah. So that means all the other things are like the entry abilities are only triggered by the forwards entering, but that last bit actually reduces the cost of your Warriors of Light backups. So it means that you could play something like Aegis into Dusk into Warrior of Light. That means you've now got 3 stacks of the next Warrior of Light you cast is reduced by 3 times, so 6. You can then play Sarah, FFL, for only 1 CP, which will then search your Warrior of Light of 4 and play it onto the field. That's just so good. And finally, Wall. Again, just a really good card to run alongside Bartz, because he enters the field, you reveal the top 5 cards you deck and add a Warrior of Light among them to your hand. So the chances of that happening are pretty high. And then when he's put from the field into the break zone, choose 1 Warrior of Light or cost 3 or less in your break zone, play it onto the field. So he dies, he gets to bring in Lena, or sorry, Dusk, that brings in Lena, that brings in 2 more things. So yeah, age as old as time at this point. But, you know, if you do flicker him using Bartz's ability, he dies, brings something back in. He also gets to look at the cards off the top of your deck and add them to your hand at the same point, as well as triggering Faris, as well as triggering Bartz to be able to regain those counters, or the crystals, sorry. And then again, he's there again, ready to sacrifice himself to block another forward if he needs to, and then bring more forwards onto the field. It's just insane. Alright, now we're moving on to the backups. So, Kuchaspel. To be honest, he's just a good 2 CP fire backup, but ultimately I like him because there are a lot of forwards out there that can't take damage. Or sorry, that can't, you know, take damage without it being reduced. So using something like Kuchaspel is important. If you're relying on Faris to kill those forwards, making sure you've got something like Kuchaspel there so that the damage can't be reduced is very, very important. Samurai, so as I mentioned, getting those crystals there ready for Bartz is important because you can't rely on generating crystals just through Bartz alone, because he probably won't stick around long enough. So having forwards already there and then playing Bartz, having 3 crystals already ready to go, your opponent goes to kill Bartz. That sucks, but at least you can, if they try to kill something else, use Bartz's ability to then flicker those. Bartz will always be the one that's trying to be killed, but again, that's why you've got these things safe there to protect him. And Samurai is also good because if you just need to deal that 1 additional K using Faris just to kill something, being able to use Samurai to increase that damage just by 1, so maybe you're only dealing 6, you want to just boost it to 7 using Samurai, you can. Right, Philo, as I mentioned before, having that wind-water generator is really good. Now, you do have in this deck 3 water backups, so the chances are you won't actually really need to play Philo, but it's just nice to have that additional resource there, ready to be able to generate the water if you need to. If you do happen to only get that 1 water backup down, and you've had to use that to play, you know, something like Faris, or Lena, or Dusk, you have that additional one there just to be able to use it. Dragoon. Again, another crystal generator. It's very important to get those crystals out, but also giving first strike to something on your turn is really good. If you attack with something, and you know, maybe you attack with Soul and your opponent's going to block with something small, you then all of a sudden use Warrior of Light's ability to give it plus 2000 power, and then you give it first strike with Dragoon. Now all of a sudden, while Soul is threatening that forward, but it doesn't have to just be that as well, it could be any other forward. It just means that you can make your forwards a lot more threatening, or just if your forward is being blocked by a forward with first strike, using Dragoon to make so they both trade out is always good. Refier, so just a colourless and a dull. Choose 1 standard unit or a job Warrior of Light forward you control, activate it, and this is really, really good. Just to be able to, you know, your opponent attacks through something, use Refier to stand that forward back up, you block with it, that forward then dies, and then you get to use Bartz's ability to pay the 3 crystals, bring it back onto the field, bring more things onto the field, and deal lots of damage with Faris is important. And yeah, just being able to kind of give yourself that backup line to be able to, that forward line of defense is really good. There aren't many dull abilities, in fact, I don't think there are any dull abilities in the forwards, but just having them there to be able to be, I mean, you can kind of read Refier as give something brave, but yeah, being able to activate it so maybe it can't be killed by ice as well is also really, really good. Aria, so an EX burst that can search 1 job Warrior of Light forward and add it to your hand. So a nice way to be able to go get that Bartz or that Faris or any other forward that you think will benefit you at the time. And it's an EX, you know, enough said really. And then finally, Sarah. So when she enters the field, you may search for a job Warrior of Light forward of course 4 or less other than light or dark and play it onto the field. So it can't play Wall, unfortunately, but it can still play the likes of Faris and Bartz and all these other things. And if you've already got something like Faris or Bartz on the field, then that means that you are going to just be dealing lots of damage when that forward enters, and it can just find you pretty much any forward in this deck other than Wall, Aegis and Arc, which is, you know, pretty strong. Amaterasu, Summon Time. So yeah, again, you need to have some sort of defense against something like Susano or Shantoto, just these board wipes, which, because you know this deck loves to go wide, but if your opponent gets rid of everything at the same time, not much you can do. So you really want to be having something like Amaterasu in hand as well, just as a form of protection. As I mentioned, Faris really is just the kind of core get rid of stuff card. So making sure to protect both her and Bartz using something like Amaterasu is important. Diablos. So being able to reactivate both your forwards and your backups is really, really good to be able to play more things, or just having the outright break a forward of 5 or more, because, you know, having those massive forwards there, something like, I don't know, Leviathan, will become a problem, especially when you can't push through, or they might have some protection against the damage. And then just to have a forward of 4 or less to 1000 power as well makes it nice and easy to kill something just using Faris. You could cast Diablos, reactivate your backups, and set something to 1, then just play Faris, kill that forward. Leviathan, again, more protection. Choose one forward during this turn. The next damage delta is reduced by 5000 instead, and then you get to draw a card, which is nice. But yeah, damage 5 as well. Yeah, if you have received 5 damage or more, all the forwards you control gain this forward cannot be chosen by your opponent's summons or abilities, which is super, super strong. So it's a nice comeback mechanic, and if you haven't quite been getting what you need, but you still manage to get a few forwards out, your opponent tries to kill some of your forwards, you play something like Leviathan, all of a sudden, your forwards are untargetable, and you can probably start swinging and going a bit more ham with a bit more freedom. And then finally, Sildra. Sildra's a really good card for this deck, because ultimately, it can search you 2 water characters or 2 category 5 characters, or one of each with a different cost, and add them to your hand. So the Samurai and Dragoon backups are both 5 cards, so it means that you can potentially color fix. If you're playing Sildra, you probably already have the water backups, and maybe you don't, who knows. But yeah, ultimately, it can search you a wind backup and a fire backup, so excellent way to be able to color fix. And it can also search you Faris, Lena, and Bartz, so, you know, there's great cards to search as well. And obviously Dusk as well, so it can search you a lot of good cards, really. And now let's go for some honourable mentions, just cards that you could switch in if you wanted to, or, you know, cards that I might have obviously omitted from this deck. So Hilda is a really good card that you probably could switch out for Arya. So she EX bursts, draw you a card, which is always nice. But damage 5, she can choose a forward of 3 near break zone and play it onto the field, and that is really, really good. Having another backup that can just bring stuff onto the field, be able to recur stuff, is awesome. Refia, so this is probably the biggest omission for this deck, and the reason behind it is that I didn't want too many light cards in the deck, and I'd rather run Wall. And also I wanted the Refia backup, but this Refia is super, super strong, because when she enters the field, you can search and Luneth, Ingus, or Ark can play it onto the field, but they can be the backups as well. So you could ultimately not run the Refia backup and run maybe the Luneth backup instead, but then when Refia comes into the field, she can then play that backup onto the field. So she is excellent for consistency, and ultimately she does have a really good attack ability to remove something if you have 4 Warrior Light forwards, which, let's face it, is not hard to do in this deck. And yeah, the one problem is the fact that she will become a lightning rod and probably die pretty quickly, but if you've got Bartz on the field, you can protect her that way, but again, she won't be able to attack because she's just re-entered the field. That's why there's so much protection in this deck, to make it so that if your forwards are dying that you want to be attacking, hopefully they will survive. King Tycoon, an EX burst wind backup that can search you either Faris or Lena, is just pretty good, to be honest. And yeah, again, it's kind of color fixing as well, because it will either search you Faris, who is a wind water, or Lena, who is just water, and he himself, sorry, I said wind water, didn't I? Fire water, Faris, and then yeah, he's a wind, so you get wind onto the field, and then it searches you either fire or water to your hand as well, which is good, either 1 for color fixing, or 2 just getting those important cards to your hand. Chocobo, again, really nice form of protection. It might be a case that your opponent is trying to kill your Bartz, you bounce him back to your hand, you get a card, and then he's able to be replayed the following turn, or just on that turn, it might be your opponent's reacting to him entering the field. And getting that card to hand as well is really good, because it means that you can probably replay whatever card it is that you have to bounce back to your hand. And then finally, Sara. Sara, just being able to buff all your Warrior Lights by 1000, just pushes them slightly out of range of certain attacks, and I've been in a lot of games where that 1000 power makes all the difference. If your opponent is running something like Vayne or Lulu, where they are screwing around with your power, being able to kind of counteract that with buffs is really useful. And this, combined with Luneth, means that you actually can buff all your Warrior Light forwards by 2000 power, which is a substantial amount and could overpower your opponent. So Sara might be a nice addition instead of potentially Arya, or the Refia backup. So yeah, ultimately I really enjoyed playing this deck, but as I said, it can clunk and there isn't a huge amount of color fixing in here. So you could run something like the Moogle class something Moogle, which can generate fire as well, because fire is an integral part of this deck. So maybe having some more fire backups in there might be useful. But ultimately there are 5 fire, there are 5 wind, and then there are 6 water backups. So they are fairly equal. But you just want to be mindful of that. But, you know, that's why we've got something like Sildra to be able to find you potentially that Aria and the either Dragoon or Samurai backup as well. So that's really good. And the general element spread across all of them is fairly even as well, actually. There's generally a bit more water trending, but they tend to be the more consistency focused cards anyway. So things like Sildra and Sarah, and Aria as well, which are getting you cards to hand or playing cards onto the field. So having more of that isn't the worst thing, because that is getting you the color fixing cards. And yeah, the few cards I have 3 of are something like Aegis and Bartz and Faris. Bartz and Faris is very obvious, but Aegis being able to make it so that 1, when he enters, you can replay or play lots of things from your hand, but 2, making it so that you have lots of forwards like party attack as well is actually a pretty big thing, because being able to party attack to just make sure you're pushing past those big forwards is important, I find, and being able to do that is really useful. And then yeah, 3 of the crystal generating backups, just because, as I said, you want to make sure you've got lots of crystals in your kind of pool ready to go for when you've got Bartz on the field. But yeah, that is my Warrior of Light deck. Let me know what you guys think about it and what changes would you make. What kind of Warrior of Light decks have you guys run? Obviously, I've omitted Earth completely from this, but still, I think it's quite powerful, and Bartz is just such a fun card to play with. I really recommend it. It doesn't even have to be a massive wall deck. It doesn't have to be entirely focused around them. Just having Bartz there, just to bounce a couple of things, is always a lot of fun. Anyway, thank you so much for watching, guys. I really appreciate it. I will try and put these videos out a bit more frequently. I know the last one I did was basically a year ago at this point, but a lot has happened in that time. But yeah, thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. Stay safe, be lucky, and I'll see you in the next video.